Hello, my name is Agata Paszka and I am a graduate student of philosophy at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. It is my utmost pleasure to present to you this series of interviews with Professor Michael Devitt, a distinguished professor of philosophy at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Over the years, Professor Devitt has published numerous books and articles, most notably on issues in philosophy of language, metaphysics, and philosophy of biology. These interviews, conducted during Professor Devitt's visit to Krakow in November 2024, center around three topics. The first one concerns Professor Devitt's philosophical development and the origins of his ideas, beginning with some early reflections from the time preceding his post-secondary education, for undergraduate and graduate training, all the way to the early period of his career which followed the completion of his PhD studies at Harvard University. The second topic concerns realism and naturalism, two guiding principles not just of Professor Devitt's metaphysics, but of the entirety of his philosophical thought. Issues concerning language, broadly construed, constitute the third topic. By discussing some of these key themes from Professor Devitt's philosophy, we strove to connect his ideas regarding many philosophical problems, often seemingly far removed from one another, whilst also acknowledging the crucial changes which occurred between his subsequent theoretical proposals. Without further ado, here's our conversation. Enjoy.
So there's a guiding principle in your vast body of works on philosophy of language and philosophy of linguistics, for that matter. Language users are largely ignorant of a lot of things. And I now want to move I want to move to discussing your book, Ignorance of Language.
Right.
Maybe let's start with with your claim that grammars are about linguistic reality and not psychological reality, because this was a very interesting thesis that you defend and that throughout that book, actually.
Yeah, and controversial, yes. Yes, well, I got engaged with linguistics first when I was at Harvard, which was, as you've already heard in these interviews, was an incredibly formative time for me. And so I not only had Quine, Putnam, and Kripke, there was Chomsky. Now, of course, he wasn't at Harvard, but he was down the road at MIT. And generative linguistics had been going only quite a short time, or at least the excitement of it been around for a short time, and it was incredibly exciting. I first experienced it when I went at Harvard I didn't formally take it, but I attended the syntax course given by George Lakoff, who has since become, of course, very well-known linguist and writer. I was absolutely gripped by this generative linguistics, generative grammars. What I saw it as an enormous leap forward in the understanding of language, because what they were revealing was something so terrifically significant about the syntactic structure of language. And from my philosophical point of view, I thought, and this is, I think, a pretty sort of common sort of view, I thought that to understand the meaning of expressions in a language, you needed to understand their syntactic properties, and you need to locate their syntactic properties, and of course you needed to locate the meanings of the units, the words. So to find out that really we didn't know nearly as much as we thought we did about the syntax, and it was much more complicated and much rich, and they were revealing it every day. So they were churning out papers, which would then be put in to be published, of course, but that takes time. Before they even came out, I remember George saying to me, I was talking to him once, and I wanted to read something on some linguistic paper which I'd heard him citing in the class, and I said, I'd like to read this because I'm interested in this particular feature of pronouns. And he said, he said, don't worry about that. That's way out of date. Hadn't even been published. And so he directed me to where I could find more unpublished stuff that was more up to date. So it was incredibly exciting. and of course these are days long before the internet, so this was all circulating in these printed sort of Xeroxed stuff. Okay, so I got very much in the grip of this, and I attended a psycholinguistics class at Harvard too, and then I went with Hartree and Gareth Evans, I went to Chomsky and Bromberger seminar at MIT. I shared the excitement, but then I was mystified right from the beginning that all this terrific excitement about grammars, which I shared, was alleged to be showing us stuff about the mind. Now, as I indicated in my opening remarks here, I think of language as a set of external to the mind symbols and representations which play this terrifically significant role in people's lives. And syntax is a study of the syntactic properties of these expressions, which are part of the explanation, a very significant part of the explanation of the causal role they play. But they're all external to the mind. Of course, they're produced by minds, we all know that. Go back to the bee. The bee, its waggle dance, was studied by von Frisch. He got a Nobel Prize for saying that this was a language and for describing its semantic and indeed syntactic properties, because it had syntactic properties of a very simple sort. So I had a similar view of the human language. Grammars, which are offered quite rightly by the linguists as theories of language, I took to be theories of the syntactic properties of these external to the mind symbols. But that isn't the view that the linguists had, the generative linguists. Their view was that these grammars were descriptive of the mind. I thought this was absolutely baffling right from the start. It took me 30-odd years before I actually wrote about it, but I always thought this was a very puzzling. And I remember talking to Hartree about it way back there. I think he shared my puzzlement, I can't remember. Shall I go on and identify my disagreement with this?
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes.
Okay.
I think this is...
So I was. What is this alternative view? Well, the alternative view, that is the Chomskyan sort of view, is that that grammars are theories of the language faculty, a sort of mental organ. Putting it in less inflated rhetoric, perhaps, lower, they're really theories of linguistic competence. And this seemed to me all wrong. Now, why? Well, first, just take a competence in general. Competence, linguistic competence, is a cognitive skill. We have many skills, like we have the skill of we have motor skills, like riding a bicycle, throwing a frisbee. We have cognitive skills, playing chess, able to play chess. We have, and most strikingly, we have the skill of thinking in a somewhat rational way. And among our skills are the skills of being able to speak and understand language. So it's a skill. And if you take any skill, our competence in it has to be distinguished from the output of the skill. Well, actually, a lot of these skills have inputs too. For example, linguistic competence is a competence, of course, to produce items of the language, but it's also a competence to understand them. So a competence to process inputs appropriately. But let's set the input side aside. Let's set it aside and just focus on outputs. So on the one hand, you've got, and this is what I wanted to emphasize, the theory of the competence to produce the outputs. You might see this as a theory of the process by which you produce the competence, and contrast that with the theory of the outputs themselves. Let's go to the bees dance to get it nice and simple again. There's the theory of the outputs. What's that? That's the theory of the waggle dance. And von Frisch came up with a theory and got a Nobel Prize for it. He is ascribing the semantics, including the syntax, because it has a bit of syntax, of the waggle dance. Von Frisch knew virtually nothing about the competence bees have, the honeybees have, to produce this waggle dance. He had a rich theory of the output and virtually no theory of the input, of the competence. Indeed, so far as I know, when I last looked, to this very day, we don't know how the bees do it. We don't know what their competence consists in. All we know is that they have something inside them, we know not what, which is apt to produce these dances and apt to understand them when other bees produce them. So there's a big difference between the theory of the output and the theory of the competence, illustrated by the bees dance, and that same distinction goes to humans. There's the theory of the linguistic properties of this output, the syntactic and semantic properties of the output, and then there's the theory of the competence. And von Frisch told us no more about the competence of the bee than there's something we know not what in the bee that is able to produce this language. I would say exactly something analogous here. The grammar of the language, human language, tells us no more about what's going on in the mind than there's something, we know not what, in the mind that is apt to produce these symbols with the syntactic and semantic properties they have.
Well, sorry.
Just let me finish the argument here on this. So there's the distinction, and I say in the course of making this distinction, I just said, the grammar tells us about the outputs. What's my basis for saying that? All right, there is this distinction, you might say, between a theory of the outputs and the theory of the competence, and I'm boldly saying the grammar is the theory of the outputs, not the competence. Well, what's the base for that? Open any grammar, any piece, the textbooks in generative grammar, and they're full of discussion, fascinating discussion in my view, of these properties of nouns, adverbs, prepositions, anaphors. That's what they're talking about, putting it in Quine's terms. That's what they're quantifying over. That's what they're committed to. That's what they're describing. And these things are nouns and verbs and adverbs and so on. They're linguistic expressions. They're not mental entities of any sort. There isn't a mental word in what grammars actually claim. So that's why I say grammars are theories of, they're theories of the output, and they show us very little about the nature of competence.
Right. So I want to focus on your criticism of the voice of competence theories from precisely by pointing us in the direction of your theory of intuition, because you hold that intuitions are empirical judgments, and they're not results, they're not consequences of people's competence. So this is also a very I think interesting claim that I guess ties nicely with your with something that I've already mentioned, right? So the sort of ignorance of linguistic users and their ignorance of language, which is really vast, I think.
Yes, well, that's certainly a central point I'm getting at. Yes, when I did get to writing about the philosophy of language, or at least writing systematically about it, which was I did in the book you mentioned, Ignorance of Language, I had the book is mostly really aiming to show what is the place of language in the mind, and indeed, as you say, and I called it ignorance of language, well, actually for a variety of reasons, but one is I want to say that the place of language in the mind is not that we know about it. Okay, so the book got a storm of criticism from Chomskyians. And one focus of the criticism was what we've just been discussing a minute ago, what I call the linguistic conception of grammars versus what I call the psychological conception of grammars. But the other storm of protest was indeed over intuitions. So why are we fussing about intuitions at all? Well, linguists, like philosophers, base their theories on intuitions, on linguistic intuitions. In the case of linguists, it's almost all intuitions about syntactic properties. In the case of philosophers, it's almost all intuitions about semantic properties like reference and truth values and so on. And I think both about, in the case of linguistics and in philosophy, that this is a mistake. I think that intuitions, as you briefly mentioned there, I think what are intuitions, the intuitions in question, seem to me to be ordinary, empirical, theory-laden judgments, differing from other such ordinary, empirical, theory-laden judgments, only in being immediate and not arising out of conscious inference, something like that. Mm-hmm. And the important thing is they're empirical, so I'm dismissing the idea that you find in philosophy that somehow our intuitions about language are a priori. And if that's what intuitions are, empirical judgments, then of course using them as evidence, you should only use them as evidence if you have some reason to believe they're reliable. Empirical judgments can often be unreliable. And my line on this is, look, we cannot, I think, have some confidence that a lot of them are reliable and a lot of them unreliable if you look at this altogether. But whatever, even if you do have, even if it is appropriate to think the intuitions that people have, whether they're linguists, philosophers, or the folk, whether you think it's appropriate to think that they're reliable, it isn't where we should rest our theories. If they're reliable intuitions, that's a good piece of evidence, no doubt about it, if you have some good reason to think they're reliable, the intuitions. But the best evidence is not intuitions, the people's intuitions about reality, it's what you get from observing reality itself. You don't do biology. Biology is the theory of living things. You don't do biology, you don't test your biological theories against the intuitions of biologists, let alone against the intuitions of the folk. You test biology by looking at the living things. So my line is that we should test linguistic theories and semantic theories. We should test them by checking the linguistic reality itself. What does that amount to? It amounts to testing linguistic usage. Look at how the linguistic reality is to be found in the use of language. And you look at that for direct evidence of the nature, the semantic and syntactic properties of the language. Intuitions, if they come from a reliable source, can often be a helpful start and a guide. But ultimately, that's what we should rest on. Tests of usage. Now, linguists traditionally, the generative linguists, which is virtually the only linguist I really know much about, the generative linguists tested their theories against their own intuitions. They would think about, and they were wonderfully inventive in thinking about linguistic strings of terms, and they would have all sorts of intuitions that this was grammatical and this wasn't grammatical, and often striking judgments, which they would confirm with a colleague or two, and then they would publish an article about this particular string of words and how it's ungrammatical, but a very similar string of words is grammatical, and all of this is very then provocative of a good syntactic theory. But that was the evidential base, the intuitions that linguists had about the syntactic properties of the strings that they were observing. In recent times, well, it's not so recent now, 20 odd years, 30, this came under criticism within linguistics, that we should not be relying on the intuitions of ourselves, we linguists. We should actually be checking these intuitions against the folk intuitions. Well, my line on all this is we shouldn't be relying on any intuitions. And insofar as we do, we should rely on the intuitions that are likely to be reliable. And so insofar as we do rely on intuitions, the tradition was right in relying on linguist intuitions, because linguists are the experts. And it's not right that we should be relying on the folk intuitions, because they're not the expert. But most of all, we shouldn't be relying on intuitions at all. We should be testing against usage. And a good thing about linguistics, where it's methodologically much better than philosophy, is that it was never the case in linguistics that the theories were only checked against intuitions. They were also checked against usage. People checked them against the corpus. You know, I mean, it was, as soon as I got interested in linguistics, I found it was enchanting to be with a linguist. You'd be in a conversation and the linguist would be noting in this very conversation, which is an example of the corpus, striking syntactic forms, which prompted them to start theorizing. For example, there was a whole, I can't remember when this came up in linguistics, it was a long time ago, the Wanna constructions. W-A-N-N-A. It's a sort of colloquial abbreviated sort of sound. So, I want to go to lunch, you say. Now, we all know that this has come from I want to go to lunch. But the linguists were very tuned into this, and they noticed that how it varied in context and where you could use the Wanna construction, where you couldn't. Fascinating stuff. What was the evidential base for this? Observation. So the linguists always were doing more than rely on their intuitions. And of course, they also had elicited production tests that came out of linguistics, which is a way of not simply relying on the corpus, but setting up an artificial situation where you produce utterances. And the aim of the experiment is to test a certain theory. You have a certain theory that such and such a form is in the language, or such and such a form is not in the language, and then you test it. And you test it by constructing a situation which, if it's in the language, you would expect it to be produced. Mm. So but I am against the linguist practice. And then, of course, you ask me this, and I don't know how much you want me to go on about that. Why do the linguists think? We could ask this about the philosophers too. But why do the linguists think that it's okay to rely on intuitions? And the very clear answer, it seems to me, that one gets in the linguistic literature relates to what we were saying a bit more about the psychological conception. The linguists think that the rules of the language are somehow embodied in the mind, and that linguists and intuitions are derived from these embodied rules in a process analogous to a deduction, and that's why they're good. The true rules of the language in the grammar, described in the grammar, are in the mind and they lead to the intuitions. This is what I call the voice of competence. Intuitions are the voice of competence. Now, of course, I don't think the grammars are describing the rules in the mind, and indeed I'm skeptical, this is a further point, I'm skeptical that the rules are in the mind, but even if they were in the mind, we have no idea how they could produce the intuitions. So I've argued at length against the voice of competence view of linguistic intuitions.
Well, it's great that you alluded to the distinction between testing intuitions and testing usage, because I want to now progress into discussing your involvement in experimental efforts in experimental semantics. So you actually started by advancing this methodological criticism, where you urge, alongside, for instance, Genevieve and Marty, that we should test usage, not intuitions,
yes.
just like you've already said. So how did it all start? How did
yes, right.
that journey
Yes,
in the experimental world start for you?
You might say it ought to have started earlier because I was committed to the theoretical position, the ideology that study of language was empirical, and yet all I'd done was do it from my armchair like everyone else. What changed for me, and as I said, I probably should have really done something earlier, because after all, I had this naturalistic view. I should have put my money where my mouth was and actually done something. But then, in a fascinating article, Mashery, Mallon, Nichols and Smith, Stitch, my old friend Stitch, in 2004 published what is the sort of seminal work in experimental semantics, and it was motivated by a criticism, by dissatisfaction with the methodology of traditional philosophy, the consulting of their own intuition, exactly analogous to the linguists. The linguists sit in their armchairs and come up with judgments about syntax, maybe confer with another linguist. Philosophers sat in their armchairs, came up with judgments about reference, maybe consulted a few others, and that was regarded as the evidence for a theory. This sort of so-called intuition mongery, of course, is not peculiar to the philosophy of language. It's regarded as a sort of standard methodology of armchair philosophy. Well, I thought it was not a good thing at all, and so did Mashery and company, Mashery et al. But they responded to this. They responded to this in the experiment. But they responded by testing folk intuitions about reference. And they actually were partly inspired by something I mentioned earlier on, linguistics. Steve Stitch particularly had a long background of engagement with linguists from the beginning of his career. I mentioned a few minutes ago that sometime, I think roughly in the 90s, the standard linguistic practice of relying on linguist intuitions was criticized by people who then went out and tested folk intuitions about syntax. And I made a critical remark about that. Well, inspired by that sort of model, Mashery et al. Criticized the philosophers for relying on their own intuition and then tested folk intuitions about reference. And as you mentioned, Genevieve Marti and I, independently, criticized this. And my criticism parallels exactly the criticism I'd made of the linguist. We said, no, you shouldn't be testing anyone's intuitions. In fact, I said, and maybe Genevieve had said, I can't remember, if you're going to use anyone's intuitions, it's better to use the philosophers, just as it's better to use the linguists, than it is to use the folk. You know, basically, pox on folk intuitions. But what you shouldn't be doing is simply relying on anyone's intuitions. You should be testing usage, and that was the that was what got me going.
Right.
I then set about, for the first time, actually trying to test usage.
So your first study that came out was from 2018, the study on proper names.
Yes.
And you got some really uniform results in most of these tests. So I want to allude to this chapter in this book edited by Andrea Bianchi on reference. Your chapter, Should Proper Names Still Seem So Problematic? And you argue that they shouldn't.
Yes.
So do you think that test confirmed your thesis?
Yes, I do. Yes, the test you are alluding to, the paper you're alluding to on proper names was with my collaborator, Nick Perot. And we tested proper names against usage using elicited production tests, which we think are great, and truth value judgment tests. And we found overwhelming support for the Kripkean view of proper names and against the description theory. And this is counter to all the results, well, an exception, a similar sort of paper with not a similar sort of paper, but a paper with similar conclusions was produced by a group of Italian philosophers, Domenici and et al., around the same time as ours, so that there were these two studies. But all the previous studies, from Mashery et al. Onwards, had all given very mixed results. And they had not confirmed Saul's view. They had not confirmed the description theory. It was just, they were results all over the place. But our result, and to a certain extent, I think it's really true to say too, of the Domenici et al. Results, were very, very determinately Kripkean. Yeah.
Well, you then set about testing biological kind terms. There are two.
Yes.
Two papers, and that wasn't, I guess, this easy. Like the results don't confirm any theories straightforwardly. At least you need some.
Right.
You need a lot of interpretational effort there. So.
Yes.
What happened?
Yes, I know. This was very salutary, this experience. So there had been quite a lot of experiments, just as there had been many on proper names, probably more on proper names than anything else. There'd been experimental testing of so-called natural kind terms, and including some biological ones. But people rightly thought that, you could probably sort of theoretically lump all these natural kind terms in together. So there'd been quite a lot of experiments over the 10 years before we did. And here I'm now moving on to a collaboration with Brian Porter. Prior to our experiments, quite a lot of experiments. And again, they had not confirmed the Kripke-Putnam sort of view. Again, they'd yield quite messy results. If you could abstract anything from them, it was that it looked as if there were both causal, historical, and descriptive elements to the reference determination of these natural kind terms. Well, Brian and I thought that, oh, by the way, a lot of these experiments had quite dramatic discoveries of contradictions. They would find that people were contradicting each other in their results, or else contradicting themselves. Very, very surprising. So we thought, when we set off on our first experiment here, that this was, our hypothesis was there were all these troubles for that these experiments were not yielding nice confirmation of the Kripke-Putnam view because they were using the wrong methodology. First of all, a whole lot of them were testing referential intuitions. And we thought that was a no-no. Some of them were testing truth value judgments, which we thought were tests of usage, but we had some sort of worries about them. But we also had worries about the fantastical nature of some of these experiments. They tended to test twin Earth situations, which are really quite, I mean, philosophers love them, and we understand them well, and we have nice intuitions about them. But the folk, we suspected, this is just a gut feeling, that the folk would be quite bemused by these fantasies, and that their intuitions about them may have been not particularly valuable. So we set about, full of hope, to confirm the Kripke-Putnam view using elicited production and truth-value judgments and not a fantastical picture at all. And yes, we didn't get anything like the results we expected. But we had a simple elicited production test first off, and we thought we won't need to go any further. It's going to settle the matter. Far from settling the matter, it gave a sort of 50-50 result. And it didn't give a result significantly different from chance. So then we did some truth-value judgments tests, and that had one group contradicting another group. And then we did another truth-value judgment test where we had an intrasubjective test where the one subject, and we found this is 50%, I'm not exaggerating, 50% of our subjects contradicted themselves. So we knew we were in trouble. And perhaps our main conclusion from this first paper was that there's something wrong with our methodology, and indeed something wrong with the methodologies of all our predecessors. However, by some sort of intricate argument, we did think that you could draw a certain substantive moral out of our experiments and the experiments that preceded us. The moral that, yes, there really is both a descriptive element and a causal historical element to the reference of natural kind terms when used by the folk, not as used by the scientists. We still thought the causal historical view was there. But if you've got a word used by the folk for a kind which played a significant practical role in their lives, we thought it likely that this would be the way the description would come in, that the reference of these terms would be partly reflecting the scientific use and the scientific causal historical view, where the term is introduced in science to serve the explanatory needs of science. We thought the Kripke-Putnam view was exactly right there, and we thought they were also exactly right, this is just hypothesis of course, when they supposed that when the folk took over such a word, they'd borrow it, and they also would be using it with that same sort of causal historical way. But where the term was not just taken over from the scientists, but used for something, a kind that played a big practical role in our lives, that part of the reference determination would be descriptive. In other words, we were contemplating, to get back to your early thing, a hybrid thing. So that's how we came out of this experiment. It led us to a very bleak view of our own experiment and other people's experiment, but also led us to rethink our whole position on the use of natural kind terms by the folk. And by the way, I should admit, as we do admit, that John Dupre, a leading philosopher of biology, who'd written way back in the 80s a view critical of the Kripke-Putnam view of natural kind terms used by the folk, or so-called natural kind terms. We should admit, and we did, that he had the right to say, "I told you so," because that's indeed what we discovered. And, what we hypothesized. And then, of course, we did another experiment to test that hypothesis. And do you want me to talk about that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. So, as I said, we came out of this first experiment feeling a bit down because our theories, our method we thought was defective. By the way, the centre of why we thought it was defective was its use of novel term, so an invented term, a term that was not already in the vocabulary of our participants. We thought that was our explanation of why we got so many things wrong. So we thought we should do another experiment where we used terms that were already familiar to the participants, and in fact we should test to see if they were, and we should use ones which we should have vignettes that are not fantastic, not twin earthy, really down to earth, and we should test whether we are right that terms that have practical significance will be very different from terms that are of purely scientific interest. And we chose two terms. For the practical term, we chose the term rice, because rice refers to a kind which is a biological kind. It's a species. Well, it's probably more than one species, actually, but anyway, it's certainly a biological taxon. But it's also of enormous practical interest to us, which I don't need to spell out. So that was our paper we called two sorts of biological terms, which we labeled practical ones and scientific ones. And this was our example of a practical one. And the scientific one we picked was Rio de Janeiro myrtle, which is the name of an extinct species of myrtle, which of course is, we speculated, not of great, if any, practical interest to the folk. So we hypothesized, we predicted that it would be covered by the causal historical theory, but that the rice would be covered by a hybrids theory. And our results confirmed that.
So, well, you've only gotten involved in experimental projects fairly recently, but I want to draw your attention to the following remark from Coming to Our Senses, where you said that it is troubling that we seem to lack a scientifically appealing method for settling the disputes that bedevil semantics. Well, fast forward 28 years, you are engaged in numerous empirical projects in semantics. So are the methods that we use now, that experimental philosophers use nowadays, scientifically appealing?
Right. Well, what we have discovered, my collaborators and I, and I think what just about everyone involved in experimental semantics have discovered, is it's bloody hard. We are all trying to come up with good empirical ways to test theories of reference. And notice, we're only talking about theories of reference. We're not talking of, and only for quite a limited range of terms. Though, of course, Brian and I have moved beyond natural kind terms to implement terms recently. So we're trying. But the history of experimental semantics has been a history of methodological failure, of which I have been a part. So, I mean, we're all trying, and it's hard. Of course, the psychologists will all tell you, look, calm down. This experimental life is very hard. It's very hard to come up with experiments that effectively do what you want them to do. But I think we are getting there. I think there's a whole history of methods being used and then criticized and then being changed, and people keep going. So I think progress is being made. So yes, I think there are more and more people getting involved, and I think more and more of us, we're learning from our past mistakes and we're moving ahead. So I'm optimistic. But what a massive amount of work remains to be done. I mean, Saul and Putnam, for that matter, we had all these intuitions about proper names. They've turned out to be pretty well right. We've had intuitions about natural kind terms. Well, we've just discovered that some of them are not right. But implement terms, all right, there was a little bit, often, by the way, called artifact terms, but I think that's a bad word for them, because the objects in question are often not artifacts. There is a bit of a literature where people, from their armchairs, come up with intuitions about the reference of artifact terms. But they're not very convincing intuitions, unlike Saul's intuitions about proper names were so overwhelmingly convincing that hardly anyone disagreed with him, about the intuitions. So we don't have much in the way of intuitions about implement terms. So when you do experiments, you're really blazing a path. With proper names, I think you were just confirming. Kripke's intuition seemed to me so overwhelmingly obviously true that testing them, which as you note I did with Nick Perot, I thought we needed to do it, but I didn't feel we learnt anything from the result, because it seemed to me before the result that it was obvious that Kripke was right. I don't think it's obvious at all what the situation is with implement terms. At the moment I'm doing a test with another collaborator, Tomasz Ziglejewicz, of social kind terms. And again, it's not obvious. What intuitions do we have about this? So you're starting in an intuition-free zone almost. And we're only just scratching the surface.
Right.
I mean, we're only talking here about nouns. There's adverbs, there's verbs. Oh, God. Yes, but I am optimistic. I think before our eyes, we're coming up with better and better methods to test. We're a long way from having got there yet.
So is experimental philosophy a real life version of a naturalistic dream?
Yes, yes it is, yes. That's right.
But there's still a lot to be done, so
Yes.
I guess it seems only fitting to say, well, now let's get back to work.
Yes. I do have to say that, so I've been preaching naturalism forever, influenced of course by Quine, but I didn't get down to practicing it quite recently, as we've agreed earlier on. And now I am practicing it. I have to say, I sort of often long for the armchair because, oh God, it's so hard putting these experiments together. And it's so hard anticipating where they'll go wrong. And as the psychologists will tell you, yeah, they're always going wrong. This is the way life is. So there's a sort of wistful thought that goes through my mind often. Ah, the good old days, you could do it all from your armchair.
But I guess that's what makes them interesting, right? That's
Yeah.
what makes the effort interesting.
Yeah.
You're a part of a very sort of a developing paradigm.
Yeah.
And it's definitely exciting to do that.
Yep. Indeed, it is. Very
And
exciting.
one which, as we've already established, is, well, basically putting your theory into practice, right?
Yeah,
So,
practicing what you preach.
yeah, practicing what you preach.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.